Hello, and welcome back to Tech Fails, the channel where we exhume the digital corpses of yesterday's innovations. We're not here to celebrate failure, but to dissect it, to understand how the smartest people with the deepest pockets can create something so bafflingly unnecessary that it becomes a permanent fixture in the museum of bad ideas. Today, we're unboxing a device so strange, so aggressively redundant, and so profoundly creepy that it deserves its own chapter in the history of technology scandals. It's cat-shaped, it's a barcode scanner, and it was supposed to save print media. I'm talking about the CueCat, a product that cost millions, gave itself away for free, and still couldn't convince people to plug a proprietary peripheral into their computer. This was all just to avoid typing a simple URL. This isn't just a flop, it's a cautionary tale about ego, convenience, and a deadly combination. It perfectly showcases solving a non-existent problem while simultaneously creating a massive privacy one. We begin in the year 1999. The internet is truly hitting its stride, and for the first time, millions of Americans are online. They are tethered to their computers by screeching dial-up modems. But there's a disconnect between the physical world and the digital one. The world of magazines, newspapers, and advertisements was struggling to keep up with the pace of the internet. They needed a bridge. Imagine you're reading a glossy magazine, perhaps Forbes or Wired, and you see an advertisement for a cool new gadget. The ad says, "Visit our website for more details." The website address is usually a long, complex string of letters and numbers, something like, the user experience back then was agonizingly slow. You had to stop reading, walk over to your desk, and fire up that slow computer. Then you waited for the dial-up connection to finish its signature handshake. After all that, you would open your browser, and only then could you begin to manually type that long, complex URL. It was a friction point that CueCat aimed to eliminate entirely. Enter Digital Convergence, a company founded by the very well-funded, very ambitious CEO, Marty Greenwald. Marty looked at this clunky, slow process and saw not just an inconvenience, but a technology scandal waiting to happen. The scandal, in his eyes, was the sheer inefficiency of the paper-to-digital jump. He believed this process was stifling the growth of online engagement with print media. His radical solution? A barcode scanner peripheral shaped like a black plastic cat head, perched on a small stand. It was designed to connect to your computer via the PS2 keyboard port, or later, USB. They called it the CueCat. The core idea was remarkably simple in theory. Instead of typing that annoying URL, magazines would print a special proprietary barcode, which they termed a Q code, right next to the article or advertisement. The user would simply pick up their handy-dandy CueCat scanner and swipe the code across the barcode. The magic would happen in the background. The CueCat software would translate that proprietary code into the correct URL. It would then instantly launch their web browser to the desired page, bypassing all that manual typing. The official marketing tagline they used for this device was quite ambitious, too. They told consumers to take the internet off the leash. But the irony of that statement would soon become apparent. Digital Convergence knew they weren't just building a gadget. They were attempting to build an entire ecosystem. For the CueCat to be remotely useful, two crucial things had to align perfectly. First, the average person had to own one of these cat-shaped peripherals. Second, magazines and newspapers had to actively print the necessary special Q codes alongside their content. Getting the magazines on board turned out to be the surprisingly easy part of the equation. Digital Convergence partnered with huge publications like Forbes, Wired, and the Dallas Morning News. They even partnered with the colossal catalog company Radio Shack. These publishers were genuinely terrified of the internet cannibalizing their ad revenue. The CueCat promised them a measurable, concrete link between a printed advertisement and a digital interaction. They were desperate for any solution that could prove print media still mattered to advertisers. But getting the scanner into consumer hands, that was the challenge they faced. The price point was a major hurdle. If it cost $50, nobody would buy it purely for the novelty factor. So, Digital Convergence made a fateful, arguably disastrous decision. They would give the CueCat away for free. They hoped forced ubiquity would create demand. They didn't just give them away haphazardly. They flooded the market with them. They strategically shipped the scanners inside major magazines, tucked neatly between the pages. They also partnered extensively with Radio Shack, who gave them away with nearly every store purchase. Estimates vary wildly, but Digital Convergence managed to distribute hundreds of thousands, potentially over 1 million, of these cat-shaped scanners to American households. Think about the sheer scale of this attempted technology scandal of forced adoption. They produced millions of units of a dedicated niche hardware peripheral that nobody had actually asked for. They distributed them all for free and built an entire infrastructure around proprietary codes. This was all based on the premise that people were too lazy to type a URL. Yet they implicitly believed those same people would not be too lazy to do a series of much more complex actions. This included plugging in a weird peripheral into their PC, installing proprietary software, and finding the physical scanner every time. Then they had to carefully swipe a barcode, which was often fiddly. It was a staggering financial investment, betting on a monumental, unnatural shift in consumer behavior. This shift simply never materialized in the real world. The economics of the operation alone were a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any minute. They were paying for the product manufacturing, the distribution logistics, and the continuous service maintenance. All this was done with the hope that advertising partners would pay them later to use the measurement system. The failure of the CueCat wasn't due to a single minor flaw. It was instead a perfect storm of poor design, flawed execution, and, most damagingly, profound ethical mistakes. The first fatal flaw was the convenience paradox. The core value proposition they marketed was convenience, promising to make things easier. Yet, the entire actual user experience was anything but convenient. First, the hardware itself was a huge hurdle. This was the era before Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connectivity dominated the computing landscape. The CueCat needed a dedicated, physical port. For many users, finding a free PS2 or even an available USB port was already an annoying hassle. It was a constant source of friction right at the start. Second, the software setup was agonizingly complex for the average user. Installing the proprietary CueCat application often led to frustrating conflicts with other existing programs on the PC. Third, the actual use of the scanner was cumbersome and restrictive. When you read a magazine, you are typically relaxed, on a couch, perhaps in bed, or on the go. The CueCat, however, was stubbornly tethered to a static desktop computer. The user had to physically move the magazine to the computer desk, scan the code, and only then could they move back. This process completely destroyed the natural, relaxed flow of reading. It was unequivocally less convenient than just typing a URL manually. And it was certainly much less convenient than the future technology that would eventually eclipse it, the instant hyperlink on a smartphone. The CueCat was designed to bridge print and digital, but it did so in the most physically restrictive way possible. The second fatal flaw was the infrastructure failure, specifically the use of a non-standard barcode system. Why didn't they just use standard UPC or EAN barcodes? The simple answer is that they wanted complete control over the system, and more importantly, they wanted to harvest and control the consumer data. This proprietary nature doomed it. The proprietary Q-code system meant that every single piece of print media had to be specially modified to participate in the ecosystem. If a magazine wasn't partnered with Digital Convergence, the CueCat was utterly useless. This created a severe walled garden effect that naturally repelled small businesses and independent publishers who couldn't afford the adoption costs. It was not an inclusive design. This became an early, clear example of a crucial lesson in tech. If your system requires universal adoption to be truly useful, and you try to force that adoption using a proprietary, expensive method, you are destined for the technology scandal's Hall of Fame. The third, and arguably most damaging flaw was the privacy catastrophe. This is where the flop turns genuinely dark and enters the realm of historical technical disasters. When you accepted one of the free CueCats, you were absolutely required to register it with your personal information. This included your name, your home address, your email, and demographic data. The scanner itself had a unique identification number permanently embedded in it. Crucially, this unique ID was linked directly to your registration profile and personal details. This meant that every single time you scanned a Q code, Digital Convergence and its partners knew exactly who you were. They knew your name and address, and what publication you were reading. They also knew which specific article or advertisement you were interested in, and the exact moment you scanned it. This was an astonishing level of detailed, physical tracking. In 2000, internet privacy was barely understood by the general public, but the mere concept of a company tracking your physical reading habits and linking it to a real-world identity was inherently creepy and invasive. This was not just tracking cookies. This was essentially spying on your reading material. Worse yet, an independent security researcher discovered a massive security vulnerability within the system. The unique user ID was stored in plain text within the CueCat software's configuration files. By exploiting this, a malicious actor could theoretically reverse engineer the tracking system and expose the specific private reading habits of every single registered user. This vulnerability became a huge, devastating part of the negative media storm that followed. It hammered the final nails into the CueCat's rapidly shrinking coffin. The whole concept was not merely a failure of technological imagination, but a spectacular ethical failure of respecting user autonomy. The core technology scandal wasn't just that the product didn't work smoothly. It was that the product was actively designed to harvest highly sensitive behavioral data on a mass scale without fully informing the user of the profound, creepy implications. Despite the millions poured into the venture, and despite the massive media partnerships and the unprecedented hardware giveaway, the CueCat simply never gained any momentum. The public reaction was swift and mercilessly negative. Tech reviewers called it an answer to a question that no one was asking. Privacy advocates loudly warned consumers about the required registration and tracking component. The sheer, utter awkwardness of the device made it an object of widespread ridicule across the budding tech blogs. The public just didn't want it. The final nail in the coffin was twofold. First, the extremely low adoption rate. Of the millions of units distributed, the percentage that were actually plugged in, software installed, and regularly used was infinitesimal. Second, the infamous .com burst. When the bubble burst in the early 2000s, funding for unprofitable ventures dried up almost instantly. The millions of dollars digital convergence was burning through were no longer sustainable. This continuous burning of cash was for manufacturing, shipping, software, and partner relations, all for a product that showed zero meaningful return on investment. The money vanished. Digital Convergence quietly filed for bankruptcy in 2001, barely 2 short years after the product's heavily publicized launch. The product was dead. The CueCat became a symbol that endures today, not a symbol of successful innovation, but a perfect symbol of the sheer hubris of the .com era. It demonstrated how vast amounts of money could be thrown at a fundamentally flawed concept. It showed where a narrow focus on data collection completely overshadowed basic, essential usability and convenience. The abandoned hardware was tossed into landfills or left in dusty closets across America. The black plastic cat head now stares blankly into the cold abyss of failed technology. So what can we, as tech observers, learn from this estimated $185 million technology scandal? The CueCat didn't just fail. It provided clear, undeniable lessons that still echo through modern development cycles today. Lesson 1. The problem must be real and painful. The CueCat only solved the minor problem of typing a URL, which was a minor inconvenience, not a painful barrier to entry. Technology that succeeds solves a major, painful problem for the user. When your solution, like finding, plugging in, and using the CueCat, is significantly more painful than the original problem, you have a guaranteed technical disaster on your hands. Never force a solution onto a non-existent problem. Lesson 2. Simplicity trumps proprietary control. The requirement for proprietary barcodes, proprietary software, and proprietary hardware made the ecosystem unnecessarily fragile and hostile to its users. Today, we understand that open standards, most notably QR codes, are the true, efficient bridge between the physical and digital worlds. If a user needs to download unique software or use unique hardware just for your product, you've already lost the battle for adoption. The QR code, a technology that was already around at the time, ultimately became the simple, free, non-proprietary solution to the exact problem the CueCat was trying to solve. It uses a standard smartphone camera, requires zero registration, and is instantly accessible to everyone. Lesson 3. Privacy is not a feature, it's a prerequisite. The most damning lesson of the CueCat is its profound disrespect for user privacy and autonomy. The blatant, mandatory registration and tracking linked to physical reading habits was a complete and utter overreach. In this current age of constant data breaches and ubiquitous surveillance, this lesson is more critical than it has ever been. Any technology scandal that involves the mass invasion of privacy, whether intentional or through negligence, is ultimately doomed to fail the public's trust. The CueCat taught a generation of consumers to be immediately suspicious of devices that demand highly personal data for what seems like a trivial, unnecessary function. It raised the awareness of online tracking dramatically. The CueCat remains a perfect, stark example of a sunset product that wasn't retired because it became old or obsolete. Instead, it was retired because it was fundamentally and deeply flawed right from its original inception. It tried to forcefully coerce the consumer's behavior to match its own complex business model. It failed because it refused to adapt its business model to match existing, simple consumer behavior. Thank you for joining us for another sobering look at a spectacular tech fail. What are your thoughts on the CueCat? Did you, by chance, ever register one of these strange devices? Do you still have one gathering dust in your basement or attic somewhere? Let me know all your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into another historical technical disaster from the past. Until next time, this is Tech Fails, reminding you that sometimes the absolute simplest solution is just typing the URL yourself.